Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. And today we are continuing and completing The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is chapters 10 through 12 of part 3, and the conclusion of the book. A spiteful rumor that Butler had become a spokesman for Father Coughlin's Christian Front led some Jewish groups to threaten cancellation of speeches he was scheduled to make to them in November. "I couldn't believe there was a word of truth in all of this," wrote Mildred Smith, executive secretary of the Open Forum Speakers Bureau, "but I dared not say an official no without a direct word from you on this matter." He wrote back indignantly, "Have never spoken for the Christian Front. I am a Quaker and am preaching tolerance, and am not connected, nor will I have anything to do with any movement or organization advocating tolerance or the entrance of this country into any foreign war." His hatred for war did not cause any diminution in his hatred for fascism, but he refused to sanction one to fight for the other except in absolute self-defense. Once he was visited by a female cousin who had married a German and brimmed over with praise for the Nazis. Butler's face grew taut as she babbled on, but he said nothing until it was time to say goodbye. Unable to contain himself any longer, he rasped at the door, "Nellie, if Hitler comes over here, thee can be sure I will be on the beach in Atlantic City to kick the everlasting hell out of him." His taste in books increasingly reflected both his anti-war and his anti-fascist convictions. In his library during the last years were Sawdust Caesar by George Seldes, The Road to War by Walter Millis, and Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. Europe Under Terror by John L. Spivak was inscribed to him as one of the best fighters against fascism in the country, and with the respect and admiration of J.L.S. In 1939, he wrote an anti-war piece for a book edited by Paul Comley French, Common Sense Neutrality, Mobilizing for Peace. Sharing the covers with him were such contributors as Eleanor Roosevelt, Charles A. Beard, Dr. Henry Elmer Barnes, Senator William Borah, Norman Thomas, Sumner Wells, Herbert Hoover, Senator Robert La Follette Jr., John L. Lewis, and Elliott Roosevelt. But as the Nazis swept through Belgium and the Netherlands on May 10th, bypassing the Maginot Line and imperiling France, millions of Americans grew alarmed. A committee to defend America by aiding allies was organized by William Allen White to rout the isolationists. In a mood of black despair, Butler delivered his last anti-war speech on May 24th at Temple University. Hating Hitler and Nazism, he nevertheless could not shake off the dread specter of 1 or 2 million dead American youths strewn over Europe's battlefields. He decried fears of a German invasion of the United States as alarmist, playing into the hands of war profiteers. From the comfortable vantage of hindsight, it is easy to fault Smedley Butler as having been woefully short-sighted in his stubborn view that the best interests of Americans were served by persisting in a policy of neutrality. But 30 years in uniform, seeing active service in every war and campaign since the Spanish-American War, had convinced him that war was nothing but a cruel and bloody swindle of the people. His suspicions were not eased by observing industrialists and bankers entering trade cartels with American potential enemies, Germany, Italy, and Japan, while U.S. arms manufacturers made huge profits selling munitions to both sides and pressed Congress to spend new billions on defense to keep up with the arms race they themselves had promoted. In his disillusionment, he saw little difference between World War I and World War II. Ever since he had been a starry-eyed Marine recruit of 16, American administrations had persistently cried wolf in order to use him and the youths under him in order to protect and augment foreign investments enwrapped in the flag. It was now impossible for him to believe that the shouts of Wolfe he heard once more were any more genuine than all those he had heard at regular intervals since 1898. Worn out by his strenuous speaking tours, discouraged as he saw the United States slipping step by step into another bloodbath, he fell ill with exhaustion. His doctor ordered him to enter the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia for a rest and examination. "As soon as I get out," he promised Ethel Butler, "I am going to take thee to Europe for the vacation I've never managed to find time for. Thee deserves it for thy patience." During his 4 weeks in the hospital, however, he lost weight rapidly and guessed that his ailment was more serious than the doctors were letting him know. On June 10th, Italy declared war on Britain and France. Roosevelt promptly called full speed ahead in the promotion of national defense and for the extension of material aid to opponents of force. The next day, Congress voted another $3.2 billion in military appropriations. On June 14th, Butler's gloom plunged into new depths when Germany invaded France unopposed. 4 days later, Admiral Harold R. Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, asked Congress for a 2-ocean navy and a $4 billion expansion program. During a visit by his son Smedley Jr., Butler reflected glumly on the futility of his long fight to keep the country from getting involved in another war. "I think," he said ruefully, "that I should have stayed with my own kind." He meant Quakers and Marines rather than politicians. On June 21st, hours before France was scheduled to surrender officially to Adolf Hitler, Smedley Darlington Butler died in the hospital of an abdominal ailment suspected to be cancer. Chapter 11. Although the paths of President Roosevelt and Smedley Butler had diverged sharply over the questions of war and peace, the president sent a wire to Ethel Butler. "I grieve to hear of Smedley's passing, and I shall always remember the old days in Haiti. My heart goes out to you and the family in this great sorrow." Among others who sent condolences were former Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, then ambassador to Mexico, and Major General Thomas Holcomb, commandant of the Marine Corps. A simple funeral service was held at the Butler home in Newtown Square, followed by burial in Westchester, with attendance limited to close friends and immediate members of the family. Ethel Butler knew that elaborate formal ceremonies would be a violation of the principles of her husband, who had always detested phony pomp and circumstance. The general, who could have had all the wealth and all the power he wanted as dictator of the United States, died leaving an estate that totaled $2,000. The New York Times now hailed him as one of the most glamorous and gallant men who ever wore the uniform of the United States Marine Corps, a brave man and an able leader of troops. He laughed at danger. He set an example to his men that helped them to carry out the traditions of the Marine Corps. Calling him also often a storm center, the Times added, "It was when he ventured into public affairs that his impetuosity got him into trouble." In an editorial obituary on June 23rd, the New York Herald Tribune had no cautious reservations. "It is as a great leatherneck that General Smedley D Butler will be remembered. He was an admirable officer, as tough as in his speech as in the fiber of his body and soul. He came of Quaker ancestry, but no Quaker more dearly loved to be belligerent, because he was utterly unafraid, brave and unselfish. He earned the characterization of being the ideal American soldier, and to use the words of an official citation in the Navy Department as being one of the most brilliant officers in the United States." 30 years later, Tom Dick Butler told me wistfully. Dad's experiences were an important part of our lives. He was always where it was at. We miss him tremendously. When the war that Smedley Butler had dreaded and sought to prevent came to his country, out of the clouds over Pearl Harbor, 18 months after his death, an American destroyer was named the USS Butler in his honor. Converted to a high-speed minesweeper, it saw distinguished service during the war. That would not have seemed inappropriate to the fighting hero who hated war as a racket, yet who had once declared, "I am a peace-loving Quaker, but when war breaks out, every damn man in my family goes." Both his sons entered the service, Smedley Jr. in the Marines and Tom Dick in the Navy. A hell-for-leather Marine officer who drove himself as hard as his men, he had won their enthusiastic admiration and loyalty. He, in turn, had been passionately and stubbornly devoted to them, in service and out of it. Former Marine Commandant David M. Shoup, who served under Butler in China, told me that he and all the men in command had respected Butler as one hell of a fine soldier. During World War II, Butler's old newspaper friend, E.Z. Demitman, interviewed Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific as a commander of the 32nd Division. General Robert L. Eichelberger, an old gimlet eye, Demitman mentioned to MacArthur and suggested that Eichelberger might be able to prove another Butler. "Never in a million years," Butler replied emphatically. "There's only one Butler, and he was one of the really great generals in American history." Chapter 12. Although Butler may have been the first high-ranking Marine Corps general to challenge establishment policies, he was not the last. Significantly, as early as July 1966, another distinguished Marine Sergeant General, former Commandant David M. Shoup, went before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to warn the American people that President Lyndon B. Johnson's escalation of the war in Vietnam was a tragic mistake. It might also be noted that before the explosion of the Pentagon Papers, 2 Marine Corps colonels wrote books denouncing the intervention in Vietnam as genocide against the people caught up in a civil war in support of a corrupt Saigon dictatorship. Perhaps the elite fighting team of the United States produces high-ranking dissenters like Butler, Shoup, and the 2 colonels because many men who choose careers as Marine Corps officers tend to be strongly motivated by patriotism and idealism. When there is an American military intervention overseas, it is usually the Marines who spearhead it, do the fighting, get an accurate picture of the real situation, and observe who is being politically supported or suppressed and why. All too often, these officers have been disillusioned by the use of the Marines to suppress social change in small countries on behalf of dictators, an elite military and business class, American commercial interests. This realization outrages their idealism. They resent the expenditure of the lives of Marines under them for the sordid motives and power games of dollar diplomacy and international politics. Hence, the most intelligent and high-principled Marine staff officers may become the bitterest of critics in American administrations that misuse the Corps. The war records, motivation, and integrity of such generals as Butler and Shoup make it impossible to dismiss their testimony expressing dismay at the way that United States expeditionary forces have been deployed in the name of national defense. Although Butler had considered himself basically a pacifist who hated war, he had placed duty on his country above all considerations and had spent 33 years of his life carrying out orders to defend it. His gradual disillusionment with these orders and the men who gave them had led him to speak out abrasively against the use of military on behalf of American vested interests. Although Butler had considered himself basically a pacifist who hated war, he had placed duty to his country above all considerations and had spent 33 years of his life carrying out orders to defend it. His gradual disillusionment with those orders and the men who gave them had led him to speak out abrasively against the military on behalf of American vested interests. No matter whose corns he tread on, the cost to his career, he had habitually said and did what he thought was right. His bluntness had made him unpopular with some presidents, secretaries of state and navy, and the highest-ranking generals and admirals in Washington, who considered him a military firebrand as irrepressible as Generals Billy Mitchell and George S. Patton. But it was just this equality of Butler that had given him the courage and integrity to face public ridicule, to expose, in the name of service to his country, what John L. Spivak called one of the most fantastic plots in American history. What was behind the plot was shrouded in the silence which had not been broken to this day. Even a generation later, those who are still alive and know all the facts have kept their silence so well that the conspiracy is not even a footnote in American histories. It would be regrettable if historians neglected this episode and future generations of Americans never heard of it. In 1964, Speaker of the House John W. McCormick referred to the plot in his speech before the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City when he warned against right-wing extremists in the Barry Goldwater camp. But he did not give any details, and only a knowledgeable handful of Americans understood the full implications of what he was talking about. The conspiracy unquestionably inspired the novel 7 Days in May, made into a successful film, which portrayed a fascist plot by high-placed American conspirators to capture the White House and establish a military dictatorship under the pretext of saving the nation from communism. Few of the million of Americans who read the novel or saw the film suspected that it had a solid basis in fact. It would seem time that school textbooks in America were revised to acknowledge our debt to the almost forgotten hero who thwarted the conspiracy to end democratic government in America. If we remembered Major General Smedley Darlington Butler for anything else, we owe him an eternal gratitude for spurning the choice to become dictator of the United States and for making damned sure that no one else did later. That's the end of the book. And my personal thoughts on this are that we continue to be under threat of fascist takeover of not only the U.S., but of the industrialized world, the global north, as some may call it. We are a couple days after the re-election of Donald Trump to his second term of office that will start on January 20th. And we just witnessed a very weak campaign by Kamala Harris and over a decade of rightward movement in the politics of the United States. And we have to resist it in whatever way we can. Not all resistance is violent, and not all violence is against people. Violence against property may sometimes be the only way to cease production of malevolence. We have the opportunity, and some would say the responsibility, to intervene in what is becoming a genocide across the globe of people. And it's not just in Palestine under and now Lebanon under the Israel Defensive Forces. It's also in the proxy wars throughout the world that we fight, and we have sent forces to Israel to bolster this genocide already, and that has happened under the administration of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. We only have each other, and that's a lot. We need to build community. If you want to stop the spread of fascism, start by working in the food pantries and the soup kitchens, because we need to build community before we can build any kind of a resistance, or maybe someday a revolution if that needs to be. America is founded on revolution by some twisted people. Our founding fathers were not great people. It wasn't in the interest of the common man that this nation was started or founded on. But now we have a chance and a lot of history that we can look back on and make better choices. We have to make better choices, and we have to be strong enough and brave enough and determined to make unpopular good choices, like supporting our neighbors who don't speak like us, or who don't look like us, or who don't worship like us. Because in Palestine, it's not just Muslims, and Muslims are not the root of terrorism. Terrorism happens by white right-wing supremacists in the US all the time. Hatred is here, but it looks like me, and it looks like a lot of us. And you know, if you look like me, and if you can you know, assimilate into spaces, or just speak out in your community, like push back against some of the crappy things that people have been saying and will be saying, because even if Trump goes for this shit, we don't. That's not what we are, and we won't go back.